Welcome to our discussion session for this module. Today, I'll be talking with Dr. Camilla Hinde, an associate professor at Wageningen University, whose research focuses on the behavioral ecology of parental care. Camilla, thanks for joining us today. Why don't we start by talking a little bit about your research interests?
Well, primarily I study family conflicts, so evolutionary conflicts of interest within a family. And we'll talk today a little bit about how each family member has different optima for the extent of parental investment. So I'm looking at how individuals deal with these kind of conflicts. I'm also interested in individual differences. We've got a project going at the moment on individual differences in mate choice. So how individuals can differ in their preferences. I can also explain why primarily I work on birds. So this is for two main reasons. First of all, birds make really discrete and quantifiable investment decisions in parental care. So investment in the egg, very quantifiable, and then afterwards in the offspring, they bring back prey, which we can measure. And that's very different from mammals, where investment's much more cryptic, in utero and via lactation. The second reason is that we can actually tease apart nature and nurture by swapping chicks in between nests, look at the effects of their original parents, for example, on their growth and development, versus the parents that reared them.
So today we're discussing family conflict, which is the idea that individual parents and offspring can disagree on the amount of care that each provides or receives. How did these disagreements arise?
Well, individuals are selected to leave as many genes as possible for future generations. So to do this, parents will benefit by looking after their offspring. This is selected in many species. But this parental care is really costly. So parents that invest a lot in their offspring have lower survival and reproductive success the next year. So that means that parents are going to disagree over the amount of care that each should provide. So each one does better if the other does more of the work. So this kind of conflict between parents is quite intuitive because they're usually unrelated and not going to breed together again. But between parents and offspring, it's slightly more involved.
Let's look at the simplest case. So one parent rearing one chick. Do the parent and chick agree on how much food the chick should get?
No, so that's where it gets interesting. So each parent is selected to provide an equal distribution of resources across all its offspring. So both current and future offspring, whereas each offspring is more related to itself than to its siblings. So offspring is selected to demand more food for themselves over their siblings, which only share half of their genes. So there's a conflict of interest between the parents who want equal share of resources and offspring who want more for themselves.
And where else does this sort of conflict arise in family life?
So you mean more parent-offspring conflict, examples of parent-offspring conflict? So we're used to thinking about it. For example, I study chicks in the nest fighting, competing to raise the highest to get food from the parents. There's also examples, for example, in mammals. There's weaning conflict. So that's where each offspring will benefit to suckle for longer and more than future siblings. And suckling for longer even can delay future siblings being born. Whereas the mother is selected to prefer an equal distribution of resources and shorter time in between offspring than is optimal for any one offspring.
So going back to the conflict between parents, in species when you've got two parents raising offspring, presumably they both want offspring to be successful. So where does this conflict arise from?
So they have a shared interest in their offspring, and they have to cooperate to rear these offspring. But the conflict of interest arises because there's a cost in providing that care. So each would benefit from saving resources for itself to breed again in the future and letting its partner do more of the work.
And optimal behavior, we usually think of it as the parents balancing or animals balancing costs and benefits in general. Why does that not work here? Why can't the parents individually just balance their own costs and benefits of caring for offspring?
Well, in family conflicts, there's other players involved.
Mhm.
So parents have to think about balancing the costs with their partner and also across siblings. So for individual offspring, it's also got to balance costs with between itself and its siblings and even its future siblings.
Sure. So how do parents avoid being exploited by their partners?
Well, one idea is partial compensation.
Mhm.
So this is where a decrease in care by one parent is met by just a partial increase by the other. So therefore, not leaving themselves open to exploitation. If they compensated fully for a decrease in care by their partner, they could be exploited. So that's one idea.
Okay. And do we have some evidence that this is actually how parents behave in wild animals?
Yes. There's good evidence from experiments that have experimentally decreased care by a partner. So that can be done by attaching little weights to the bird and temporarily reducing its care.
Like to the tail?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that has shown evidence for partial compensation. But there have been lots of experiments that have had really mixed results. So some had no effect and some even had full compensation. And some studies that have increased parental care by one partner have shown a matching response and increase by the other. So there's been a whole range of responses. I think that this could be due to a number of reasons that are actually really interesting. So one reason could be that there's information contained in the work rate by one partner.
Yep.
So an increase in care by one would lead to an increase in the other if that change in behaviour by one parent gave information, for example, about chick need. There's another idea about why you might get this whole variety of responses. So an increase in care in response to a partner is more beneficial at low quality chicks and when they're hungry and when they're full and when good conditions, partial compensation might happen. So you might get different responses depending on the environment, and that really needs more work.
Okay. So going back to the subject of exploitation for a moment, would offspring do better if their parents weren't doing this partial compensation, undercutting each other?
Absolutely, yeah. So sexual conflict between the parents means that they're both withholding care to avoid exploitation by their partner. So if we manage to overcome this conflict, then the offspring would get more resources.
Okay. And what are the mechanisms? Are there mechanisms animals can use to kind of get around this negative effect?
Yes, that's actually what we're researching at the moment. So one idea is just that a simple turn-taking rule could alleviate this conflict.
You mentioned sibling conflict before. Is this a difference between siblings over how much care each should receive?
Exactly, yeah. So because siblings are related to each other, they will be selected to share resources to a certain extent. But of course, they're much more related to themselves. They share all of their genes with themselves versus only half with their siblings. So this is why you get sibling conflict both within a current family, but also with future siblings.
Yeah, so they're competing with not only the siblings they're sharing the current breeding attempt with, but also all the ones down the line in future breeding seasons.
That's right, yeah. So demanding resources from your parents now reduces their potential to have siblings in the future. So there's a conflict there between current and future offspring.
And what kind of evidence do we have empirically for these sibling rivalries in nature?
Well, we're used to thinking about, I mentioned earlier, siblings competing in a nest for food. So you see, for example, blackbird chicks reaching up to get the worm. So that's siblings competing with each other. There's also much more overt examples. So, for example, masked boobies, birds, they actually one sibling always kills the other one outright. So that's extreme sibling conflict.
So why do they lay 2 eggs then if one sibling's always killing the other one?
Yeah, well, that's an insurance policy. So breeding in birds is usually very seasonal. You don't want to miss this timing to have offspring. So you wouldn't want to lay just 1 egg. Parents wouldn't be selected to just lay 1 egg and then it might not hatch. So they lay 2 and the strongest one kills the weaker one.
Okay. To wrap things up, what current research or questions in this area are you interested in at the moment? So what do we still need to know about these conflicts among carers and offspring?
Yeah. So what I'm really excited about at the moment is looking at individual differences, how individuals overcome these family conflicts, particularly interested in sexual conflict and how partners, some partners could be more compatible than others, and that could overcome some of this conflict, and how relationships build up, and parents are more able to negotiate. Some are more able to negotiate than others.
Yeah.
So I think that's
when you talk about compatibility, you mean that there's not some sort of perfect mate for you. You're trying to match some are better than others for you, but not objectively better.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Good match between parents.
Great. That's really interesting. Camilla, many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
There's a tendency to think that animals within family groups all want the best for each other. As we've seen, the truth is often much more complicated. We need to look at the benefits and costs for each individual to predict how cooperative they will be towards their partners or siblings, and we should expect animals to always be wary of exploitation. See you next time.